Okay, we're going to start right in because there's a lot to cover on autistic disorder, and I hope there's questions during. So when did the world start to hear about autistic kids? It was pretty recently. It wasn't until the late 1930s. And Professor Connor, who migrated over from Europe, was the head of child psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, wrote many editions of the world-famous child psychiatry textbook. And families, a few and then more from around the world, heard of Dr. Connor and would fly their kids to Baltimore because the parents didn't know what to do. Sometimes these kids were extremely intelligent, if you could get them to sit for an IQ test, with sometimes amazing verbal and memory abilities, but the kids seemed in their own worlds. So autism, or having autistic features, was thought to be a symptom of schizophrenia back then, isolated in your own world, not able to relate. And Connor said, these kids really don't have schizophrenia, they don't have hallucinations and delusions, but he delineated a syndrome, and we'll talk about the features of it in a couple of minutes. And he called it early infantile autism, because the parents reported that these kids were really different since the time they were babies. These kids seemed to be not able to relate socially. Sometimes they didn't really speak, even though if you could measure it nonverbally, they seemed to have great intelligence. Or sometimes if they did speak, they had real oddities of language, like repeating what someone would say. Echolalia is the term for that. And one of the striking features that became known as this got worked up was these kids would have severe tantrums or severe behavioral disturbances if their daily routine were altered just a bit. So they had some highly obsessional, as he called it, need for preservation of sameness. Now, he didn't say this, although he suspected it. Others a few decades later said this, that he thought this must be caused by these highly intellectual, very distant parents, that there was some tremendous attachment disruption from the earliest months of life. Now, at the same time, and as World War II was breaking out all over Europe, Dr. Asperger, independently in European journals, was writing about very similar characteristics of kids, but he focused on kids with very high intelligence, with tremendous social lack of awareness and language oddities, and this subgroup, of course, became known as having Asperger's syndrome. So the syndrome became named after him. So over the next couple of decades, Bruno Bettelheim, concentration camp survivor, became a famous psychoanalyst, worked at his orthogenic school in Chicago with what were now called autistic kids, and analyzed their parents and said, there's a very clear cause. These kids have been emotionally refrigerated from the first months of life. These kids don't even have an insecure attachment. They have no attachment at all because their parents are so cold and intellectualized, and so it's a very psychological, psychogenic causation. The famous book he wrote in 1967 is called The Empty Fortress, where he would analyze their obsessive play and need for sameness and sort of hypothesize about the lack of any attachment bonds. Now, during this time, who got brought into clinics? The orthogenic school in Chicago or child psychiatry in Baltimore, wealthy, upper middle class to upper class, primarily white kids. So this was thought to be a very select disorder of a certain social class. And the way we'll talk next time about eating disorders were thought to be a white, upper middle class, female phenomenon. But this is called referral bias. We've mentioned this way back in earlier lectures. If you go door to door around the country or the world and do interviews, you might get a very different picture. But who might show up at a clinic may be a very selected, because who could afford to fly via overnight jet to Baltimore to see Professor Connor? So it was only a very selected group that would come in. But we now know that autism doesn't really have social class barriers or racial barriers. But for a long time, it was thought to be very exclusive. Now the lore, and there's a lot of fascination with autism, was that all autistic kids are really geniuses inside. Sometimes they were called autistic savants. Many of you have seen The Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman's Academy Award-winning performance. Hard to get at it because of the oddities of behavior and speech, but there's huge memory or musical or artistic abilities. Now, as we'll find out, this turns out to be fairly rare, but in some cases it is. And so for generations, people have been saying, if only we could unlock this sort of hidden potential, these huge islands of intelligence that underlie autism. So by the 70s and then 80s, in Europe and in America, more data are collected, not just from these selected exclusive cases. It turns out that people with autism often, certainly not always, have parents and grandparents who were somewhere on the spectrum of autism too. Makes you think about heritability. Maybe there's some genetic transmission, not just psychological lack of attachment. Again, as we just talked about, the larger studies are looking at autistic features, not just exclusively in white upper-class kids. Professor Rutter over in England, doing one of the original follow-up studies, found that by mid to late adolescence, a quarter of kids with autism diagnosed in childhood were having very serious seizure disorders. Makes you wonder about the attachment-related psychogenic cause. Maybe there's an underlying neurological condition that, over time, with heterotypic continuity, there's some real brain disturbance and seizure disorder breaking out in a quarter of these kids. So, as happened with ADHD, and as happened with conduct disorder, and almost everything else, from a purely family psychosocial view, things shifted to genes and biology. The problem was, autism was so rare, you couldn't do the twin and adoption study methods that you could for ADHD or schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder. So it was hard to know how genetic, quote-unquote, the condition was. What do we think today? You don't either have autism or you don't at all, just like with ADHD, just like with bipolar disorder. This exists on a spectrum. All of us, especially us guys, are a little more analytical, not too empathic, and if you go across the population, the extreme of that, very analytic thinking, very non-empathic thinking, not too socially attuned, might be autism. But it exists on a spectrum, just like almost everything else we've talked about in this course. DSM-5, that came out just about a year ago, embraced this notion so much that rather than having separate subcategories, anybody with these symptoms is now called having an autism spectrum disorder. Even the people formerly called Asperger's syndrome, with very high IQs and these symptoms, Asperger's was removed from the DSM. Now, a lot of people said, Asperger's is a good label. This really distinguishes high-functioning people with autism. But the idea behind the DSM-5 thinking was it's all on a spectrum. So we're not going to call a separate subgroup having Asperger's syndrome. Everybody who meets criteria is somewhere on the autism spectrum. There's a larger category, downplayed in DSM-5, it was big in DSM-4, called pervasive developmental disorders. What if you had some autistic features, you're a little bit odd in your motor behavior, a little bit odd in your speech behavior, but you don't have them all? Those were called pervasive developmental disorders, which we're not going to emphasize that much. So how frequent is autism? Here's where the big shift has occurred. Back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, if you went and tried to really measure these symptoms, the prevalence was about 2 or 3 kids out of every 10,000. So it wasn't 1%, it wasn't 0.1 or 2%, it was 0.02 or 3%, 2 or 3 out of 10,000. Very rare. But what if you really take up the notion of an autism spectrum? You might have very severe or yet milder forms of the symptoms we'll talk about in just a minute on the next slide. Well, if you've noticed and been reading the paper, especially in California, but all over the country and actually the world, if you take a more lenient view of how to classify autism spectrum disorders, it's now over 2% of all boys and close to 1% of all girls. So it's not a couple in 10,000, it's a couple of every 100. Now, is this an epidemic of autism, or have we just redefined it on the spectrum so that many kids with social and language oddities who formerly would have been called intellectually disabled or learning disabled or some other diagnosis are now being called autistic? So that's the big question. A question here. So what was the benefit of removing this diagnosis of Asperger's? Well, in fact, they're probably going to reinsert it in DSM-6, and things go back and forth. But the idea was that we need to acknowledge that there's a spectrum. And you can have autistic features with a very high IQ, or an average, or a below average IQ. Most people with autism have low average IQs. And the idea was we need to start thinking about these things as on a bell curve rather than as separate categories. So DSM-5 has made a small step toward removing some of the specific names of subcategories and looking at the spectrum. But many people say it didn't go far enough. So it's in my controversy, right? Other questions about the history of autism, some of the stuff we're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe a lot of the Silicon Valley types and computer nerds, maybe they've got some autism spectrum symptoms and it's more accepted now. We'll talk about that in just a minute because this is one of the theories as to why autism is rising in prevalence so much. Who else? Yeah, right here. So a big study just done in Korea 2 years ago by a professor who's going to start at UCSF next month, Young-Shin Kim, who's both an epidemiologist and a psychiatrist and a geneticist too. They did a national survey in South Korea a couple of years ago, not just people at clinics, but went to school districts all over the country. The prevalence of autism, very severe autism with intellectual disability, was way under 1% the way it is in America, but autism spectrum was 3%, even higher than the US. And again, is this a spectrum where we could diagnose these partial symptom constellations? Not many other national studies have been done like this, but it seems to be rising around the world, not just in the US. That's the short answer. All right, so let's go ahead. So before we get into the specific symptoms, what the geneticists are trying to do now is, in order to study heritability, severe classic autism is still pretty rare. The spectrum is more frequent. So what's studied is what's called the broad phenotype. Maybe if your kid has pretty severe autism, maybe you as a parent have some social oddities, or your language is a bit unusual. You've got really highly idiosyncratic interests. So you would have some, but not all of the symptoms. That's the broad phenotype. So what's one of the theories as to not just that we're diagnosing it more, but there really may be more autism? Well, Simon Baron-Cohen, the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, Borat. Simon Baron-Cohen is a famous psychologist in the United Kingdom, and he's been studying this for a couple of decades. And so he has two theories. One is, look, autistic features are just extremely stereotypic male features. What do most guys stereotypically do? Screw feelings. They're way too complicated. Let's analyze. Let's systematize. And if you look at people with autism spectrum disorders, they're very analytic and kind of specifying, and feelings are kind of a pain in the neck. We don't really deal with those. So if you look at questionnaires as to sort of maleness and femaleness, people with autism have these classically male traits. What makes males males? It's complicated. The Y chromosome, but what does the Y chromosome do? It helps the body during prenatal development squirt out a bunch of this poison called androgen. And androgen slows down your brain development. And androgen at its extreme takes away a lot of empathy. And so maybe autism is kind of a maleness caused by androgenization. Really provocative, controversial. And Baron-Cohen has a second aspect of his theory as to why autism would be rising. And he calls it the Silicon Valley Syndrome. What's happened in the last 30, 40 years? It's kind of cool to be a nerd. Nerds are trillionaires. Nerds run the world. And so formerly, fairly nerdy, computer-savvy guy wouldn't really meet any mates, but now he might meet a fairly nerdy Silicon Valley-type gal, and they have kids together. And so you escalate those nerdy, male-dominant traits. So it's a provocative, not yet fully proven theory that by assortative mating, and given the prevalence of kind of computer nerd culture these days, more people with these tendencies are getting together, and their kids, because of heritability, have a sort of magnified tendency. Very interesting. Yeah. Oh, there's all kinds of stuff done. So how do you test androgen? Well, you can get saliva samples, you do blood samples, or you can do what? Hold your hand out and look at your middle finger and look at your index finger and see how different they are, and if they're very close, et cetera, especially if you're a later born guy, it shows more androgenization, and maybe it intensifies in later pregnancies. And so I know psychologists who go to festivals and fairs, and you ask the person to put their hand down, and you make a copy of it, and you get their relative androgenization. Is this a little bit related to autism? It might be. Is it related to being a gay guy because of androgenization? Lots of biological theories we don't have time to get into. Back here. Right, very good point, but the rise in autism diagnoses, no one's claiming that the classic autistic child with very limited intellectual abilities, that prevalence is staying flat. The rise is in the upper IQ, formerly Asperger's. So maybe that's why we're getting the rise in the spectrum, okay? So controversial. So what are we talking about here? There's three main symptom clusters that Connor talked about back in the 30s and early 40s that are still the main features thought to characterize autism today. As we'll talk about in a second, categories 1 and 2 have been kind of clumped together. But I think it's helpful to think about them in these three ways. So the main feature is, if you have autism or you're high on the autism spectrum, even when you're a baby, what do babies do? They have a preference for looking at human faces. And autistic kids and autistic adults, now with fancy eye tracking studies, so you can look at a person with autism looking at a computer screen of faces. And what do people with autism do? As you kind of track in real time, they look at the ears, and they look at the crown of the head, and they look at the chin, and they don't look at the mouth and the eyes. Whereas most people, if you're looking at someone else, you look at the mouth and eyes. So maybe there's a kind of aversion to looking at faces. A basic social aversion, which then plays out in, these are babies who don't like to be cuddled, and parents who say, what the hell's gone wrong? We thought maybe she was deaf and didn't hear, and now she seems to be so isolated, and So there's a fundamental social gap or deficit. As kids get older, they have trouble making friends because they act weird. Now, some people with autism have very low language abilities, but even if you do have strong language abilities, they're often related to specific, very idiosyncratic interests. So that's why number 1 and 2 have been merged together. It's thought that the social gaps and deficits are highly related to some of the language gaps and deficits. What do you do when you go to the playground on a nice spring day or a park and you see young families with their kids and there's a bird flying and the dad goes, "Look, Junior, there's a bird." And what does the kid do? "Look, Daddy, a bird." And that's called joint attention. The dad or the mom is pointing at something and the kid follows the gaze, and it's kind of classic. It's very pointed, really human moment. Prospective studies of, say, siblings of kids with autism who are at high risk show that these kids are very delayed in that joint attention interest. They don't seem to really care as much that their parent is pointing at the bird or the cool object or the kite, and so the social deficit appears early. It's not just later in life, or not even during the preschool years, during the first year or 2 of life. Second main feature, language. Most people with autism diagnoses have an intellectual disability. They don't score very high in IQ tests, so language may be delayed. The biggest predictor of whether a kid with autism will have a decent shot at an independent life is, do they have speech by age 4 or 5? And if they don't, it's hard to elicit it later. But even for the higher functioning kids, the so-called Asperger's kids, whose language may be quite advanced, the language is idiosyncratic and focused around certain very restricted interests that the kid finds fascinating, but most other people say, "Okay, great, it's really wonderful about your stamp collection. I'm sick of hearing about it." One of the first kids with autism I worked with as an undergraduate when I was a camp counselor back a long time ago was a very smart 12-year-old boy at a residential camp. And I remember Robbie very well, and he lived in Boston, the campus up in New Hampshire, and if you've ever been to Boston, how do you get around the city? You can take the T, or you can take the trackless trolleys. And Robbie would inevitably start every conversation by saying, "Hello, have you seen the trackless trolleys? I saw one, and it's kind of the antenna that hook up to the wires overhead, and it shut down. It doesn't have its power." Fascinating, yeah. Now, the 15th time you meet Robbie, that's the only thing he really was interested in, it seemed, were the trackless trolleys. So, as you might guess, if that's your extent of your language, it's going to be hard to make a lot of social connections because kids are going to think, that kid's weird. That kid only has certain very specified interests. Now, you could get Robbie to talk about many other things too, but that's what he'd always lead with. So it's either undeveloped expressive language, in the more severe cases, or even in kids with good language abilities, restricted, odd, idiosyncratic language. The third feature I mentioned a few minutes ago, many, if not most, kids with autism have very restricted interests, and if those interests are imposed in a different way, you try to break the morning routine or have the kid play with different toys, there's a lot of disruptive behavior. There seems to be, Connor had the kind of classic term, an obsessive interest in the preservation of sameness. And breaking routines is really hard for many kids with autism. You'll get tantrums, you'll get the kid not engaged in school or with the parents at all. Sometimes it's not just restricted behaviors and interests, it's stereotype movements, hand flapping, even in some kids with more severe autism, self-injurious behavior, smacking themselves on the head. Seems to be differently motivated from NSSI we talked about a few weeks ago. Maybe there's actually some brain circuitry that, because of, we don't know exactly what, a lack of ability to engage in the world, they're self-stimulatory and even self-destructive behaviors. So, social, language, restricted and stereotype behaviors are the 3. In DSM-5, the social and language are now kind of in one big broad category with the restricted behaviors and et cetera in the second category. DSM-4 said, if you've got autism or an autism spectrum disorder, man, you can't have ADHD and vice versa. And now, because of the growing numbers of kids with autism spectrum disorders, many of whom are highly inattentive and some highly impulsive, we now say, you know what, maybe you could have aspects of both. And maybe ADHD treatments like medications will help kids with autism spectrum disorders learn. Doesn't cure the fundamental social deficit, but maybe we can treat at least some of the attention problems, get these kids more engaged in class. What's really interesting is that heritability of autism is, as we'll say in a minute, estimated to be even higher than it is for ADHD. It really runs in families, and it's genes, not environments, that cause these symptoms. But what? There's a few genes that seem to confer some risk for ADHD. We talked about this weeks ago, dopamine-related genes. The same genes are now found to underlie the risk for autism in many cases, even though the symptoms can be quite different. So it may be that there's a genetic vulnerability at the level of basic brain development, how neurotransmitter systems develop, and whether you've got BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, this chemical up there that helps your neurons kind of grow to the next neuron in the chain. But early experiences, both in utero and early social experiences, shape what kind of symptoms you'll have. The same genes, in another extension, the International Genetics Consortium published a big piece just last year, similar genes appear to underlie schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. Well, they're very different symptoms of these disorders, but the genetic vulnerability may be much more basic, and it's early experience that actually sort of tells the system how the symptoms will look later. So, most kids, then onto adolescence and adulthood, because autism tends to persist, most kids in the autism spectrum, 2/3, maybe 3/4, have low cognitive abilities, would test out in the intellectually disabled range. And these are the kids with very poor language skills, and the kids with extreme social isolation, and it takes a lot of work, but we'll talk about early intervention, to try to help these kids get back on track. 1/4, or maybe 1/3, depending on your definitions, have what used to be called high-functioning autism or Asperger's. You got to do some work in an IQ test to get the kids engaged and really focus